False dawn. The Forties. I. Hey, verbena and mignonette, scented the languid July day. Large strawberries, crimsoning through sprigs of mint, floated in a bowl of pale yellow cup on the veranda table. An old Georgian bowl, with complex reflections on polygonal flanks, engraved with the racy arms between lions' heads. Now and again the gentlemen, warned by a menacing hum, slapped their cheeks, their brows, or their bald crowns. But they did so as furtively as possible, for Mr. Halston Racy, on whose veranda they sat for, would not admit that there were mosquitoes at High Point. The strawberries came from Mr. Racy's kitchen garden. The Georgian bowl came from his great-grandfather, father of the signer. The veranda was that of his country house, which stood on a height above the Sound, at a convenient driving distance from his town house in Canal Street. "Another glass, Commodore," said Mr. Racy, shaking out a cambric handkerchief the size of a tablecloth and applying a corner of it to his steaming brow. Mr. Jameson Ledgely smiled and took another glass. He was known as the Commodore among his intimates because of having been in the Navy in his youth, and having taken part, as a midshipman under Admiral Porter, in the War of 1812. This jolly sunburnt bachelor, whose face resembled that of one of the bronze idols he might have brought back with him, had kept his naval air, though long retired from the service, and his white duck trousers, his gold-braided cap and shining teeth, still made him look as if he might be in command of a frigate. Instead of that, he had just sailed over a party of friends from his own place on the Long Island shore, and his trim white sloop was now lying in the bay below the point. The Halston Racy house overlooked a lawn sloping to the Sound. The lawn was Mr. Racy's pride. It was mown with a scythe once a fortnight, and rolled in the spring by an old white horse specially shod for the purpose. Below the veranda the turf was broken by 3 round beds of rose geranium, heliotrope and Bengal roses, which Mrs. Racy tended in gauntlet gloves, under a small 6-hinged sunshade that folded back on its carved ivory handle. The house, remodeled and enlarged by Mr. Racy on his marriage, had played a part in the Revolutionary War as the settler's cottage where Benedict Arnold had had his headquarters. A contemporary print of it hung in Mr. Racy's study, but no one could have detected the humble outline of the old house in the majestic stone-colored dwelling built of tongued-and-grooved boards, with an angle tower, tall narrow windows, and a veranda on chamfered posts, that figured so confidently as a Tuscan villa. Downing's Landscape Gardening in America. There was the same difference between the rude lithograph of the earlier house and the fine steel engraving of its successor, with a specimen weeping beech on the lawn, as between the buildings themselves. Mr. Seven Racy had reason to think well of his architect. He thought well of most things related to himself by ties of blood or interest. No one had ever been quite sure that he made Mrs. Racy happy, but he was known to have the highest opinion of her. So it was with his daughters, Sarah Ann and Mary Adeline, fresher replicas of the lymphatic Mrs. Racy. No one would have sworn that they were quite at ease with their genial parent, yet everyone knew how loud he was in their praises. But the most remarkable object within the range of Mr. Racy's self-approval was his son Louis. And yet, as Jameson Ledgely, who was given to speaking his mind, had once observed, you wouldn't have supposed young Louis was exactly the kind of craft Halston would have turned out if he'd had the designing of his son and heir. Mr. Racy was a monumental man. His extent in height, width and thickness was so nearly the same that whichever way he was turned, one had an almost equally broad view of him, and every inch of that mighty circumference was so exquisitely cared for that to a farmer's eye he might have suggested a great agricultural estate of which not an acre is untilled. Even his baldness, which was in proportion to the rest, looked as if it received a special daily polish, and on a hot day his whole person was like some wonderful example of the costliest irrigation. There was so much of him, and he had so many planes, that it was fascinating to watch each runnel of moisture follow its own particular watershed. Even on his large, fresh-looking hands the 9 drops divided, trickling in different ways from the ridges of the fingers. And as for his forehead and temples, and the raised cushion of cheek beneath each of his lower lids, every one of these slopes had its own particular stream, its hollow pools and sudden cataracts, and the sight was never unpleasant, because his whole vast bubbling surface was of such a clean and hearty pink, and the exuding moisture so perceptibly flavored with expensive eau de cologne and the best French soap. Mrs. Racy, though built on a less heroic scale, had a pale amplitude which, when she put on her best watered silk, the kind that stood alone, and framed her countenance in the innumerable blonde lace ruffles and clustered purple grapes of her newest Paris cap almost balanced her husband's bulk. Yet from this full 10-rigged pair, as the Commodore would have put it, had issued the lean little runt of a Louis, a shrimp of a baby, a shaver of a boy, and now a youth as scant as an ordinary man's midday shadow. All these things, Louis himself mused, dangling his legs from the veranda rail, were undoubtedly passing through the minds of the four gentlemen grouped about his father's bowl of cup. Mr. Robert Huzzard, the banker, a tall, broad man, who looked big in any company but Mr. Racy's, leaned back, lifted his glass, and bowed to Louis. "Here's to the grand tour." "Don't perch on that rail like a sparrow, my boy," Mr. Racy said reprovingly, and Louis dropped to his feet and returned Mr. Huzzard's bow. "I wasn't thinking," he stammered. It was his too frequent excuse 11. Mr. Ambrose Huzzard, the banker's younger brother, Mr. Ledgely and Mr. Donaldson Kent, all raised their glasses and cheerily echoed, "The grand tour." Louis bowed again and put his lips to the glass he had forgot. In reality, he had eyes only for Mr. Donaldson Kent, his father's cousin, a silent man with a lean hawk-like profile who looked like a retired revolutionary hero and lived in daily fear of the most trifling risk or responsibility. To this prudent and circumspect citizen had come, some years earlier, the unexpected and altogether inexcusable demand that he should look after the daughter of his only brother, Julius Kent. Julius had died in Italy. Well, that was his own business, if he chose to live there. But to let his wife die before him, and to leave a minor daughter, and a will entrusting her 12 to the guardianship of his esteemed elder brother, Donaldson Kent Esquire, of Kent's Point, Long Island, and Great Jones Street, New York. Well, as Mr. Kent himself said, and as his wife said for him, there had never been anything whatever in Mr. Kent's attitude or behavior to justify the ungrateful Julius, whose debts he had more than once paid in laying on him this final burden. The girl came. She was 14, she was considered plain, she was small and black and skinny. Her name was Beatrice, which was bad enough, and made worse by the fact that it had been shortened by ignorant foreigners to Trishy. But she was eager, serviceable, and good-tempered, and as Mr. and Mrs. Kent's friends pointed out, her plainness made everything easy. There were 2 Kent boys growing up, Bill and Donald, and 13 if this penniless cousin had been compounded of cream and roses. Well, she would have taken more watching, and might have rewarded the kindness of her uncle and aunt by some act of wicked ingratitude. But this risk being obviated by her appearance, they could be good-natured to her without afterthought, and to be good-natured was natural to them. So, as the years passed, she gradually became the guardian of her guardians, since it was equally natural to Mr. and Mrs. Kent to throw themselves in helpless reliance on everyone whom they did not nervously fear or mistrust. "Yes, he's off on Monday," Mr. Racy said, nodding sharply at Louis, who had set down his glass after one sip. "Empty it, you shirk," the nod commanded, and Louis, throwing back his head, gulped down the draught, though it almost stuck 14 in his lean throat. He had already had to take 2 glasses, and even this scant conviviality was too much for him, and likely to result in a mood of excited volubility, followed by a morose evening and a head the next morning. And he wanted to keep his mind clear that day, and to think steadily and lucidly of Trishy Kent. Of course he couldn't marry her, yet. He was 21 that very day, and still entirely dependent on his father. And he wasn't altogether sorry to be going first on this grand tour. It was what he had always dreamed of, pined for, from the moment when his infant eyes had first been drawn to the prince of European cities in the long upper passage that smelt of matting. And all that Trishy had told him about Italy had confirmed and intensified the longing 15 to have been going there with her as his guide, his Beatrice. For she had given him a little Dante of her father's, with a steel-engraved frontispiece of Beatrice, and his sister Mary Adeline, who had been taught Italian by one of the romantic Milanese exiles, had helped her brother out with the grammar. The thought of going to Italy with Trishy was only a dream, but later, as man and wife, they would return there, and by that time, perhaps, it was Louis who would be her guide, and reveal to her the historic marvels of her birthplace, of which after all she knew so little, except in minor domestic ways that were quaint but unimportant. The prospect swelled her suitor's bosom, and reconciled him to the idea of their separation. After all, he secretly 16 felt himself to be still a boy, and it was as a man that he would return. He meant to tell her that when they met the next day. When he came back, his character would be formed, his knowledge of life, which he already thought considerable, would be complete, and then no one could keep them apart. He smiled in advance to think how little his father's shouting and booming would impress a man on his return from the grand tour. The gentlemen were telling anecdotes about their own early experiences in Europe. None of them, not even Mr. Racy, had traveled as extensively as it was intended that Lewis should, but the two Huzzards had been twice to England on banking matters, and Commodore Ledgely, a bold man, to France and Belgium as well, not to speak of his early experiences in the Far East. All 317 had kept a vivid and amused recollection, slightly tinged with disapprobation, of what they had seen. Oh, those French wenches. The Commodore chuckled through his white teeth, but poor Mr. Kent, who had gone abroad on his honeymoon, had been caught in Paris by the Revolution of 1830, had had the fever in Florence, and had nearly been arrested as a spy in Vienna. And the only satisfactory episode in this disastrous, and never repeated, adventure had been the fact of his having been mistaken for the Duke of Wellington, as he was trying to slip out of a Viennese hotel in his courier's blue surtout, by a crowd who had been, well, very gratifying in their enthusiasm, Mr. Kent admitted. How my poor brother Julius could have lived in Europe. Well, look at the consequences, he used to say, as if poor 18 Trichy's plainness gave an awful point to his moral. There's one thing in Paris, my boy, that you must be warned against. Those gambling hells in the Palais Royal, Mr. Kent insisted. I never set foot in the places myself, but a glance at the outside was enough. I knew a feller that was fleeced of a fortune there, Mr. Henry Huzzard confirmed, while the Commodore, at his 10th glass, chuckled with moist eyes. The trollops, oh the trollops. As for Vienna, said Mr. Kent. Even in London, said Mr. Ambrose Huzzard, a young man must be on his lookout against gamblers. Every form of swindling is practiced, and the touts are always on the lookout for greenhorns, a term, he added apologetically, which 19 they apply to any traveler new to the country. In Paris, said Mr. Kent, I was once within an ace of being challenged to fight a duel. He fetched a sigh of horror and relief, and glanced reassuredly down the Sound in the direction of his own peaceful roof tree. Oh, a duel, laughed the Commodore. A man can fight duels here. I fought a dozen when I was a young feller in New Orleans. The Commodore's mother had been a Southern lady, and after his father's death had spent some years with her parents in Louisiana, so that her son's varied experiences had begun early. 'Bout women, he smiled confidentially, holding out his empty glass to Mr. Racy. The ladies, exclaimed Mr. Kent in a voice of warning. The gentlemen rose to their feet, the 20 Commodore quite as promptly and steadily as the others. The drawing-room window opened, and from it emerged Mrs. Racy, in a ruffled sarcenet dress and point de Paris cap, followed by her 2 daughters in starched organdie with pink spencers. Mr. Racy looked with proud approval at his womenkind. Gentlemen, said Mrs. Racy, in a perfectly even voice, supper is on the table, and if you will do Mr. Racy and myself the favor. The favor, ma'am, said Mr. Ambrose Huzzard, is on your side in so amiably inviting us. Mrs. Racy curtsied, the gentleman bowed, and Mr. Racy said, Your arm to Mrs. Racy, Huzzard. This little farewell party is a family affair, and the other gentlemen must content themselves 21 with my 2 daughters. Sarah Ann, Mary Adeline. The Commodore and Mr. John Huzzard advanced ceremoniously toward the 2 girls, and Mr. Kent, being a cousin, closed the procession between Mr. Racy and Lewis. Oh, that supper table! The vision of it used sometimes to rise before Lewis Racy's eyes in outlandish foreign places. For though not a large or fastidious eater when he was at home, he was afterward, in lands of chestnut flour and garlic and queer bearded sea things, to suffer many pangs of hunger at the thought of that opulent board. In the center stood the Racy apern of pierced silver, holding aloft a bunch of June roses, surrounded by dangling baskets of sugared almonds and striped peppermints, and grouped about this decorative motif were Lowestoft 22 platters heavy with piles of raspberries, strawberries, and the first Delaware peaches, an outer flanking of heaped-up cookies, crullers, strawberry shortcake, piping hot cornbread, and deep golden butter in moist blocks still bedewed from the muslin swathings of the dairy, led the eye to the Virginia ham in front of Mr. Racy, and the twin dishes of scrambled eggs on toast and broiled bluefish over which his wife presided. Louis could never afterward fit into this intricate pattern the side dishes of deviled turkey legs and creamed chicken hash, the sliced cucumbers and tomatoes, the heavy silver jugs of butter-colored cream, the floating island, slips, and lemon jellies that were somehow interwoven with the solider elements of the design. But they were all there, either together or successively, and so were the towering piles of waffles real 23ing on their foundations, and the slender silver jugs of maple syrup perpetually escorting them about the table as Black Dinah replenished the supply. They ate, oh, how they all ate, though the ladies were supposed only to nibble, but the good things on Louis's plate remained untouched until, ever and again, an admonishing glance from Mr. Racy, or an entreating one from Mary Adeline, made him insert a languid fork into the heap. And all the while Mr. Racy continued to hold forth. A young man, in my opinion, before setting up for himself, must see the world, form his taste, fortify his judgment. He must study the most famous monuments, examine the organization of foreign societies, and the habits and customs of those older civilizations whose yoke it has been 24 our glory to cast off. Though he may see in them much to deplore and to reprove, some of the gals, though, Commodore Leslie was heard to interject, much that will make him give thanks for the privilege of having been born and brought up under our own free institutions, yet I believe he will also, Mr. Racy conceded it with magnanimity, be able to learn much. The Sundays, though, Mr. Kent hazarded warningly, and Mrs. Racy breathed across to her son. Ah, that's what I say. Mr. Racy did not like interruption, and he met it by growing visibly larger. His huge bulk hung a moment, like an avalanche, above the silence which followed Mr. Kent's interjection and Mrs. Racy's murmur. Then he crashed down on both 25. The Sundays, the Sundays. Well, what of the Sundays? What is there to frighten a good Episcopalian in what we call the Continental Sunday? I presume that we're all churchmen here, eh? No puling Methodists or atheistical Unitarians at my table tonight, that I'm aware of. Nor will I offend the ladies of my household by assuming that they have secretly lent an ear to the Baptist ranter in the chapel at the foot of our lane. No, I thought not. Well then, I say, what's all this flutter about the papists? Far be it from me to approve of their heathenish doctrines, but damn it, they go to church, don't they? And they have a real service, as we do, don't they? And real clergy, and not a lot of nondescripts dressed like laymen, and damned badly at that, who chat familiarly with the Almighty in their own vulgar lingo. No 26, sir. He swung about on the shrinking Mr. Kent. It's not the church I'm afraid of in foreign countries, it's the sewers, sir. Mrs. Racy had grown very pale. Louis knew that she too was deeply perturbed about the sewers. And the night air, she scarce audibly sighed. But Mr. Racy had taken up his main theme again. In my opinion, if a young man travels at all, he must travel as extensively as his means permit, must see as much of the world as he can. Those are my son's sailing orders, Commodore, and here's to his carrying them out to the best of his powers. Black Dinah, removing the Virginia ham, or rather such of its bony structure as alone remained on the dish, had managed to make room for a bowl of punch, from which Mr. Racy poured deep 27 ladlefuls of perfumed fire into the glasses, ranged before him on a silver tray. The gentlemen rose, the ladies smiled and wept, and Louis's health and the success of the grand tour were toasted with an eloquence which caused Mrs. Racy, with a hasty nod to her daughters, and a covering rustle of starched flounces, to shepherd them softly from the room. After all, Louis heard her murmur to them on the threshold, "Your father's using such language shows that he's in the best of humor with dear Louis 28. Roman 2. In spite of his enforced potations, Louis Racy was up the next morning before sunrise. Unlatching his shutters without noise, he looked forth over the wet lawn merged in a blur of shrubberies, and the waters of the Sound dimly seen beneath a sky full of stars. His head ached but his heart glowed. What was before him was thrilling enough to clear a heavier brain than his. He dressed quickly and completely, save for his shoes, and then, stripping the flowered quilt from his high mahogany bed, rolled it in a tight bundle under his arm. Thus enigmatically equipped he 29 was feeling his way, shoes in hand, through the darkness of the upper story to the slippery oak stairs, when he was startled by a candle gleam in the pitch blackness of the hall below. He held his breath, and leaning over the stair rail saw with amazement his sister Mary Adeline come forth, cloaked and bonneted, but also in stocking feet, from the passage leading to the pantry. She too carried a double burden, her shoes and the candle in one hand, in the other a large covered basket that weighed down her bare arm. Brother and sister stopped and stared at each other in the blue dusk. The upward slant of the candlelight distorted Mary Adeline's mild features, twisting them into a frightened grin as Louis stole down to join her. "Oh," she whispered. "What in the world are you doing here? I was just 30 getting together a few things for that poor young Mrs. Poe down the lane, who's so ill before mother goes to the storeroom. You won't tell, will you?" Louis signaled his complicity and cautiously slid open the bolt of the front door. They durst not say more till they were out of earshot. On the doorstep, they sat down to put on their shoes, then they hastened on without a word through the ghostly shrubberies till they reached the gate into the lane. "But you, Louis?" the sister suddenly questioned, with an astonished stare at the rolled-up quilt under her brother's arm. "Oh, look here, Addie," he broke off and began to grope in his pocket. "I haven't much about me. The old gentleman keeps me as close 31 as ever, but here's $1 if you think that poor Mrs. Poe could use it. I'd be too happy. Consider it a privilege." "Oh, Louis, how noble, how generous of you. Of course I can buy a few extra things with it. They never see meat unless I can bring them a bit, you know, and I fear she's dying of a decline, and she and her mother are so fiery proud." She wept with gratitude, and Louis drew a breath of relief. He had diverted her attention from the bed quilt. "Ah, there's the breeze," he murmured, sniffing the suddenly chilled air. "Yes, I must be off. I must be back before the sun is up," said Mary Adeline anxiously, "and it would never do if mother knew." "She doesn't know of your visits to Mrs. Poe." A look of childish guile sharpened Mary Adeline's undeveloped face. 32, she does, of course, but yet she doesn't. We've arranged it so. You see, Mr. Poe's an atheist, and so father. "I see," Louis nodded. "Well, we part here. I'm off for a swim," he said glibly. But abruptly he turned back and caught his sister's arm. "Sister, tell Mrs. Poe, please, that I heard her husband give a reading from his poems in New York 2 nights ago." "Oh, Louis, but father says he's a blasphemer. And that he's a great poet, a great poet. Tell her that from me, will you please, Mary Adeline?" "Oh, brother, I couldn't. We never speak of him," the startled girl faltered, hurrying away. In the cove where the Commodore's sloop had ridden a few hours earlier, a biggish rowing boat took the waking ripples. 33 young Racy paddled out to her, fastened his skiff to the moorings, and hastily clambered into the boat. From various recesses of his pockets he produced rope, string, a carpet layer's needle and other unexpected and incongruous tackle. Then, lashing one of the oars across the top of the other, and jamming the latter upright between the forward thwart and the bow, he rigged the flowered bed quilt on this mast, knotted a rope to the free end of the quilt, and sat down in the stern, one hand on the rudder, the other on his improvised sheet. Venus, brooding silverly above a line of pale green sky, made a pool of glory in the sea, as the dawn breeze plumped the lover's sail. On the shelving pebbles of another cove, 2 or 3 miles down the Sound, 34 Louis Racy lowered his queer sail and beached his boat. A clump of willows on the shingle edge mysteriously stirred and parted, and Treachy Kent was in his arms. The sun was just pushing above a belt of low clouds in the east, spattering them with liquid gold, and Venus blanched as the light spread upward. But under the willows it was still dusk, a watery green dusk in which the secret murmurs of the night were caught. Treachy," the young man cried, kneeling beside her, and then, a moment later, "My angel, are you sure that no one guesses?" The girl gave a faint laugh which screwed up her funny nose. She leaned her head on his shoulder, her round forehead and rough braids pressed against his cheek, her hands in his, breathing quickly and joyfully. 35. "I thought I should never get here," Louis grumbled, "with that ridiculous bed quilt, and it'll be broad day soon. To think that I was of age yesterday, and must come to you in a boat rigged like a child's toy on a duck pond. If you knew how it humiliates me." "What does it matter, dear, since you're of age now and your own master?" "But am I, though? He says so, but it's only on his own terms, only while I do what he wants. You'll see. I've a credit of $10,000. 10,000, du here, placed to my name in a London bank, and not a penny here to bless myself with meanwhile. Why, Treachy, darling, why, what's the matter?" She flung her arms about his neck, and through their innocent kisses he could 36 taste her tears. "What is it, Treachy? he implored her. I'd forgotten it was to be our last day together till you spoke of London. Cruel, cruel, she reproached him, and through the green twilight of the willows her eyes blazed on him like two stormy stars. No other eyes he knew could express such elemental rage as Trishi's. You little spitfire you, he laughed back somewhat chokingly. Yes, it's our last day, but not for long. At our age 2 years are not so very long after all, are they? And when I come back to you I'll come as my own master, independent, free, come to claim you in face of everything and everybody. Think of that, darling, and be brave for my sake. Brave and patient, as I mean to be, he declared heroically. 37. Oh, but you'll see other girls, heaps and heaps of them, in those wicked old countries where they're so lovely. My Uncle Kent says the European countries are all wicked, even my own poor Italy. But you, Trishi, you'll be seeing cousins Bill and Donald meanwhile, seeing them all day long and every day. And you know you've a weakness for that great hulk of a Bill. Ah, if only I stood 6'1" in my stockings, I'd go with an easier heart, you fickle child. He tried to banter her. Fickle, fickle me, oh Louis. He felt the premonitory sweep of sobs, and his untried courage failed him. It was delicious, in theory, to hold weeping beauty to one's breast, but terribly alarming, he found in practice. There came a responsive twitching in his throat. 38. No, firm as adamant, true as steel. That's what we both mean to be, isn't it, Cara? Caro, yes, she sighed, appeased. And you'll write to me regularly, Trishi, long letters. I may count on that, mayn't I, wherever I am? And they must all be numbered, every one of them, so that I shall know at once if I've missed one, remember. And Louis, you'll wear them here. She touched his breast. Oh, not all, she added, laughing, for they'd make such a big bundle that you'd soon have a hump in front like Pulcinella, but always at least the last one, just the last one. Promise. Always, I promise, as long as they're kind, he said, still struggling to take a spirited line. 39. Oh, Louis, they will be, as long as yours are, and long afterward. Venus failed and vanished in the sun's uprising. 40. Roman 3. The crucial moment, Louis had always known, would be not that of his farewell to Trishi, but of his final interview with his father. On that everything hung, his immediate future as well as his more distant prospects. As he stole home in the early sunlight, over the dew-drenched grass, he glanced up apprehensively at Mr. Racy's windows and thanked his stars that they were still tightly shuttered. There was no doubt, as Mrs. Racy said, that her husband's, using language, before ladies showed him to be in high good humor, relaxed and slippered, as it were, a state his family so seldom saw him in that Louis had sometimes. 41 tinily wondered to what awful descent from the clouds he and his 2 sisters owed their timorous being. It was all very well to tell himself, as he often did, that the bulk of the money was his mother's, and that he could turn her round his little finger. What difference did that make? Mr. Racy, the day after his marriage, had quietly taken over the management of his wife's property, and deducted from the very moderate allowance he accorded her all her little personal expenses, even to the postage stamps she used, and the dollars she put in the plate every Sunday. He called the allowance her pin money, since, as he often reminded her, he paid all the household bills himself, so that Mrs. Racy's quarterly pittance could be entirely devoted, if she chose, to frills and feathers. And will be, if you respect my wishes. 42, my dear, he always added. I like to see a handsome figure well set off, and not to have our friends imagine, when they come to dine, that Mrs. Racy is sick above stairs, and I've replaced her by a poor relation in alpaca. In compliance with which Mrs. Racy, at once flattered and terrified, spent her last penny in adorning herself and her daughters, and had to stint their bedroom fires, and the servants' meals, in order to find a penny for any private necessity. Mr. Racy had long since convinced his wife that this method of dealing with her, if not lavish, was suitable, and in fact handsome. When she spoke of the subject to her relations, it was with tears of gratitude for her husband's kindness in assuming the management of her property. As he managed it exceedingly well, her hard-headed brothers, glad to have 43 the responsibility off their hands, and convinced that, if left to herself, she would have muddled her money away in ill-advised charities, were disposed to share her approval of Mr. Racy, though her old mother sometimes said helplessly, when I think that Lucy Ann can't as much as have a drop of gruel brought up to her without his weighing the oatmeal, But even that was only whispered, lest Mr. Racy's mysterious faculty of hearing what was said behind his back should bring sudden reprisals on the venerable lady to whom he always alluded, with a tremor in his genial voice, as my dear mother-in-law, unless indeed she will allow me to call her, more briefly but more truly, my dear mother. To Lewis hitherto, Mr. Racy had meted the same measure as to the females of the household. He had dressed him 44 well, educated him expensively, lauded him to the skies, and counted every penny of his allowance. Yet there was a difference, and Lewis was as well aware of it as anyone. The dream, the ambition, the passion of Mr. Racy's life was, as his son knew, to found a family, and he had only Lewis to found it with. He believed in primogeniture, in heirlooms, in entailed estates, in all the ritual of the English landed tradition. No one was louder than he in praise of the democratic institutions under which he lived, but he never thought of them as affecting that more private but more important institution, the family. And to the family, all his care and all his thoughts were given. The result, as Lewis dimly guessed, was that upon his own shrinking and inadequate head was centered all the passion contained 45 in the vast expanse of Mr. Racy's breast. Lewis was his very own, and Lewis represented what was most dear to him. And for both these reasons, Mr. Racy set an inordinate value on the boy, a quite different thing, Lewis thought, from loving him. Mr. Racy was particularly proud of his son's taste for letters. Himself not a wholly unread man, he admired intensely what he called the cultivated gentleman. And that was what Lewis was evidently going to be. Could he have combined with this tendency a manlier frame, and an interest in the few forms of sport, then popular among gentlemen, Mr. Racy's satisfaction would have been complete. But whose is, in this disappointing world? Meanwhile he flattered himself that, Lewis being still young and malleable, and his health certainly mending, 46 years of travel and adventure might send him back a very different figure, physically as well as mentally. Mr. Racy had himself traveled in his youth, and was persuaded that the experience was formative. He secretly hoped for the return of a bronzed and broadened Lewis, seasoned by independence and adventure, and having discreetly sown his wild oats in foreign pastures, where they would not contaminate the home crop. All this Lewis guessed, and he guessed as well that these two wander years were intended by Mr. Racy to lead up to a marriage and an establishment after Mr. Racy's own heart, but in which Lewis was not to have even a consulting voice. He's going to give me all the advantages, for his own purpose. The young man summed it up as he went 47 down to join the family at the breakfast table. Mr. Racy was never more resplendent than at that moment of the day and season. His spotless white duck trousers, strapped under kid boots, his thin kerseymere coat, and drab peak waistcoat crossed below a snowy stock, made him look as fresh as the morning, and as appetizing as the peaches and cream banked before him. Opposite sat Mrs. Racy, immaculate also, but paler than usual, as became a mother about to part from her only son, and between the two was Sarah Ann, unusually pink, and apparently occupied in trying to screen her sister's empty seat. Lewis greeted them and seated himself at his mother's right. Mr. Racy drew out his Gillichie repeating watch, and detaching it from 48, its heavy gold chain, laid it on the table beside him. Mary Adeline is late again. It is a somewhat unusual thing for a sister to be late at the last meal she is to take, for 2 years, with her only brother. Oh, Mr. Racy, Mrs. Racy faltered. I say the idea is peculiar. Perhaps, said Mr. Racy sarcastically, I am going to be blessed with a peculiar daughter. I'm afraid Mary Adeline is beginning a sick headache, sir. She tried to get up, but really could not, said Sarah Ann in a rush. Mr. Racy's only reply was to arch ironic eyebrows, and Lewis hastily intervened. I'm sorry, sir, but it may be my fault. Mrs. Racy paled, Sarah Ann purpled, and Mr. Racy echoed with 49 punctilious incredulity. Your fault. In being the occasion, sir, of last night's too sumptuous festivity. Ha ha ha, Mr. Racy laughed, his thunders instantly dispelled. He pushed back his chair and nodded to his son with a smile. And the two, leaving the ladies to wash up the teacups, as was still the habit in genteel families, betook themselves to Mr. Racy's study. What Mr. Racy studied in this apartment, except the accounts, and ways of making himself unpleasant to his family, Lewis had never been able to discover. It was a small, bare, formidable room, and the young man, who never crossed the threshold but with a sinking of his heart, felt it sink lower than ever. Now, he thought. Mr. Racy took the only easy chair, and began 50. My dear fellow, our time is short, but long enough for what I have to say. In a few hours you will be setting out on your great journey, an important event in the life of any young man. Your talents and character, combined with your means of improving the opportunity, make me hope that in your case it will be decisive. I expect you to come home from this trip a man. So far, it was all to order, so to speak. Lewis could have recited it beforehand. He bent his head in acquiescence. A man, Mr. Racy repeated, prepared to play a considerable part in the social life of the community. I expect you to be a figure in New York, and I shall give you the means to be so. He cleared his throat. But means are not enough, though you must never forget that they are essential. Education, 51, polish, experience of the world, these are what so many of our men of standing lack. What do they know of art or letters? We have had little time here to produce either as yet. You spoke. Mr. Racy broke off with a crushing courtesy. Oh no, his son stammered. Ah, I thought you might be about to allude to certain blasphemous penny-a-liners, whose poetic ravings are said to have given them a kind of pothouse notoriety. Lewis reddened at the allusion but was silent, and his father went on. Where is our Byron, our Scott, our Shakespeare? And in painting it is the same. Where are our old masters? We are not without contemporary talent, but for works of genius we must still look to the past. We must, in most cases, content ourselves with copies. Ah, here 52, I know, my dear boy, I touch a responsive chord. Your love of the arts has not passed unperceived, and I desire to do all I can to encourage it. Your future position in the world, your duties and obligations as a gentleman and a man of fortune, will not permit you to become, yourself, an eminent painter or a famous sculptor. But I shall raise no objection to your dabbling in these arts as an amateur, at least while you are traveling abroad. It will form your taste, strengthen your judgment, and give you, I hope, the discernment necessary to select for me a few masterpieces which shall not be copies. Copies, Mr. Racy pursued with a deepening emphasis, are for the less discriminating or for those less blessed with this world's goods. Yes, my dear Lewis, I wish to create a gallery of heirlooms. Your mother participates in 53, this ambition. She desires to see on our walls a few original specimens of the Italian genius. Raphael, I fear, we can hardly aspire to, but a Domenichino, an Albano, a Carlo Dalsi, a Guercino, a Carlo Meretta, one or two of Salvator Rosa's noble landscapes. You see my idea. There shall be a Racy gallery, and it shall be your mission to get together its nucleus. Mr. Racy paused and mopped his flowing forehead. I believe I could have given my son no task more to his liking. Oh no, sir, none indeed. Lewis cried, flushing and paling. He had in fact never suspected this part of his father's plan, and his heart swelled with the honor of so unforeseen a mission. Nothing, in truth, could have made him prouder or happier. For a moment he forgot love, forgot Trichy, forgot every 54 thing but the rapture of moving among the masterpieces of which he had so long dreamed, moving not as a mere hungry spectator, but as one whose privilege it should at least be to single out and carry away some of the lesser treasures. He could hardly take in what had happened, and the shock of the announcement left him, as usual, inarticulate. He heard his father booming on, developing the plan, explaining with his usual pompous precision that one of the partners of the London bank in which Lewis's funds were deposited was himself a noted collector, and had agreed to provide the young traveler with letters of introduction to other connoisseurs, both in France and Italy, so that Lewis's acquisitions might be made under the most enlightened guidance. It is, Mr. Racy concluded, in order 55 to put you on a footing of equality with the best collectors that I have placed such a large sum at your disposal. I reckon that for $10,000 you can travel for 2 years in the very best style, and I mean to place another 5,000 to your credit. He paused, and let the syllables drop slowly into his son's brain. $5,000 for the purchase of works of art which eventually, remember, will be yours, and will be handed on, I trust, to your sons as long as the name of Racy survives. A length of time, Mr. Racy's tone seemed to imply, hardly to be measured in periods less extensive than those of the Egyptian dynasties. Lewis heard him with a whirling brain. $5,000. The sum seemed so enormous, even in dollars, and so incalculably larger when translated into any 56 continental currency, that he wondered why his father in advance had given up all hope of a Raphael. If I travel economically, he said to himself, and deny myself unnecessary luxuries, I may yet be able to surprise him by bringing one back. And my mother, how magnanimous, how splendid. Now I see why she has consented to all the little economies that sometimes seemed so paltry and so humiliating. The young man's eyes filled with tears, but he was still silent, though he longed as never before to express his gratitude and admiration to his father. He had entered the study expecting a parting sermon on the subject of thrift, coupled with the prospective announcement of a suitable establishment. He could even guess the particular hussard girl his father had in view, and instead he had been told to 57 spend his princely allowance in a princely manner, and to return home with a gallery of masterpieces. At least, he murmured to himself, it shall contain a Correggio. Well, sir, Mr. Racy boomed. Oh, sir, his son cried, and flung himself on the vast slope of the parental waistcoat. Amid all these accumulated joys there murmured deep down in him the thought that nothing had been said or done to interfere with his secret plans about Trichy. It seemed almost as if his father had tacitly accepted the idea of their unmentioned engagement, and Louis felt half guilty at not confessing to it then and there. But the gods are formidable even when they unbend, never more so, perhaps, than at such moments. 59-58. Part 2. Roman Fours. Louis Racy stood on a projecting rock and surveyed the sublime spectacle of Mont Blanc. It was a brilliant August day, and the air at that height was already so sharp that he had had to put on his fur-lined pelisse. Behind him, at a respectful distance, was the traveling servant who, at a signal, had brought it up to him. Below, in the bend of the mountain road, stood the light and elegant carriage which had carried him thus far on his travels. Scarcely more than a year had passed since he had waved a farewell to New York from the deck of the packet-ship headed down the bay. Yet, to the young 62 man confidently facing Mont Blanc, nothing seemed left in him of that fluid and insubstantial being, the former Louis Racy, save a lurking and abeyant fear of Mr. Racy Sr. Even that, however, was so attenuated by distance and time, so far sunk below the horizon, and anchored on the far side of the globe, that it stirred in its sleep only when a handsomely folded and wafered letter in his parents' writing was handed out across the desk of some continental counting-house. Mr. Racy Sr. did not write often, and when he did it was in a bland and stilted strain. He felt at a disadvantage on paper, and his natural sarcasm was swamped in the rolling periods which it cost him hours of labor to bring forth, so that the dreaded quality lurked for his son only in the curve of certain letters, and in a positively awful way of 63 writing out, at full length, the word Esquire. It was not that Louis had broken with all the memories of his past of a year ago. Many still lingered in him, or rather had been transferred to the new man he had become, as for instance his tenderness for Trichy Kent, which, somewhat to his surprise, had obstinately resisted all the assaults of English keepsake beauties and almond-eyed houris of the East. It startled him, at times, to find Trichy's short dusky face, with its round forehead, the widely spaced eyes and the high cheekbones, starting out at him suddenly in the street of some legendary town, or in a landscape of languid beauty, just as he had now and again been arrested in an exotic garden by the very scent of the verbena under the veranda at home. His travels had confirmed 64 rather than weakened the family view of Trichy's plainness. She could not be made to fit into any of the patterns of female beauty so far submitted to him. Yet there she was, ensconced in his new heart, and mind as deeply as in the old, though her kisses seemed less vivid and the peculiar rough notes of her voice hardly reached him. Sometimes, half irritably, he said to himself that with an effort he could disperse her once for all. Yet she lived on in him, unseen yet ineffaceable, like the image on a daguerreotype plate, no less there because so often invisible. To the new Louis, however, the whole business was less important than he had once thought it. His suddenly acquired maturity made Trichy seem a petted child rather than the guide, the Beatrice he had once considered her, and he promised 65 essayed himself, with an elderly smile, that as soon as he got to Italy he would write her the long letter for which he was now considerably in her debt. His travels had first carried him to England. There he spent some weeks in collecting letters and recommendations for his tour, in purchasing his traveling carriage and its numerous appurtenances, and in driving in it from Cathedral Town to storied Castle, omitting nothing, from Abbotsford to Kenilworth, which deserved the attention of a cultivated mind. From England, he crossed to Calais, moving slowly southward to the Mediterranean. And there, taking ship for the Purus, he plunged into pure romance, and the tourist became a jower. It was the East which had made him into a new Louis Racy. The East, so squalid and splendid, so pestilent and so 66 poetic, so full of knavery and romance and fleas and nightingales, and so different, alike in its glories and its dirt, from what his studious youth had dreamed. After Smyrna and the bazaars, after Damascus and Palmyra, the Acropolis, Mytilene and Sunium, what could be left in his mind of Canal Street and the lawn above the Sound? Even the mosquitoes, which seemed at first the only connecting link, were different, because he fought with them in scenes so different. And a young gentleman who had journeyed across the desert in Arabian dress, slept under goat's hair tents, been attacked by robbers in the Peloponnesus, and despoiled by his own escort at Baalbek, and by customs officials everywhere, could not but look with a smile on the terrors that walk New York and the Hudson River. Encased in security and monotony, that 67 other Louis Racy, when his little figure bobbed up to the surface, seemed like a newborn babe preserved in alcohol. Even Mr. Racy Sr.'s thunders were now no more than the far-off murmur of summer lightning on a perfect evening. Had Mr. Racy ever really frightened Louis? Why, now he was not even frightened by Mont Blanc. He was still gazing with a sense of easy equality at its awful pinnacles when another traveling carriage paused near his own, and a young man, eagerly jumping from it, and also followed by a servant with a cloak, began to mount the slope. Louis at once recognized the carriage, and the light springing figure of the young man, his blue coat and swelling stock, and the scar slightly distorting his handsome and eloquent mouth. It was the Englishman who had arrived at 68 the Montanvert in the night before with a valet, a guide, and such a cargo of books, maps and sketching materials as threatened to overshadow even Louis's outfit. Louis, at first, had not been greatly drawn to the newcomer, who, seated aloof in the dining room, seemed not to see his fellow traveler. The truth was that Louis was dying for a little conversation. His astonishing experiences were so tightly packed in him, with no outlet save the meager trickle of his nightly diary, that he felt they would soon melt into the vague blur of other people's travels, unless he could give them fresh reality by talking them over. And the stranger with the deep blue eyes that matched his coat, the scarred cheek and eloquent lip, seemed to Louis a worthy listener. The Englishman appeared to think otherwise. He preserved an air of moody abstraction 69, which Louis's vanity imagined him to have put on as the gods becloud themselves for their secret errands, and the curtness of his good night was, Louis flattered himself, surpassed only by the young New Yorker S. But today all was different. The stranger advanced affably, raised his hat from his tossed statue-like hair, and inquired with a smile, "Are you by any chance interested in the forms of cirrus clouds?" His voice was as sweet as his smile, and the two were reinforced by a glance so winning that it made the odd question seem not only pertinent but natural. Louis, though surprised, was not disconcerted. He merely colored with the unwonted sense of his ignorance, and replied ingenuously, "I believe, sir, I am interested in everything 70. "A noble answer," cried the other and held out his hand. "But I must add," Louis continued with courageous honesty, "that I have never as yet had occasion to occupy myself particularly with the forms of cirrus clouds." His companion looked at him merrily. "That," said he, "is no reason why you shouldn't begin to do so now," to which Louis as merrily agreed. "For in order to be interested in things," the other continued more gravely, "it is only necessary to see them, and I believe I am not wrong in saying that you are one of the privileged beings to whom the seeing eye has been given." Louis blushed his agreement, and his interlocutor continued, "You are one of those who have been on the road to Damascus 71. "On the road, I've been to the place itself," the wanderer exclaimed, bursting with the particulars of his travels, and then blushed more deeply at the perception that the other's use of the name had of course been figurative. The young Englishman's face lit up. "You've been to Damascus, literally been there yourself. But that may be almost as interesting, in its quite different way, as the formation of clouds or lichens. For the present," he continued with a gesture toward the mountain, "I must devote myself to the extremely inadequate rendering of some of these delicate aiguilles. A bit of drudgery not likely to interest you in the face of so sublime a scene. But perhaps this evening, if, as I think, we are staying in the same inn, you will give me a few minutes of your society and tell me something of your travels. My father 72, he added with his engaging smile, has had packed with my paintbrushes a few bottles of a wholly trustworthy Madeira, and if you will favor me with your company at dinner. He signed to his servant to undo the sketching materials, spread his cloak on the rock, and was already lost in his task as Lewis descended to the carriage. The Madeira proved as trustworthy as his host had promised. Perhaps it was its exceptional quality which threw such a golden luster over the dinner, unless it were rather the conversation of the blue-eyed Englishman which made Lewis Racy, always a small drinker, feel that in his company every drop was nectar. When Lewis joined his host, it had been with the secret hope of at last being able to talk, but when the evening was over 73 and they kept it up to the small hours, he perceived that he had chiefly listened. Yet there had been no sense of suppression, of thwarted volubility. He had been given all the openings he wanted. Only, whenever he produced a little fact, it was instantly overflowed by the other's imagination, till it burned like a dull pebble tossed into a rushing stream. For whatever Lewis said was seen by his companion from a new angle, and suggested a new train of thought. Each commonplace item of experience became a many-faceted crystal, flashing with unexpected fires. The young Englishman's mind moved in a world of associations and references far more richly peopled than Lewis's, but his eager communicativeness, his directness of speech and manner, instantly opened its gates to the simpler youth. It was certainly not the Madeira which sped the 74 hours and flooded them with magic, but the magic gave the Madeira excellent, and reputed of its kind, as Lewis afterward learned, a taste no other vintage was to have for him. "Oh, but we must meet again in Italy. There are many things there that I could perhaps help you to see," the young Englishman declared as they swore eternal friendship on the stairs of the sleeping in 75. It was in a tiny Venetian church, no more than a chapel, that Lewis Racy's eyes had been unsealed, in a dull-looking little church not even mentioned in the guidebooks. But for his chance encounter with the young Englishman in the shadow of Mont Blanc, Lewis would never have heard of the place. But then what else that was worth knowing would he ever have heard of, he wondered. He had stood a long time looking at the frescoes, put off at first. He could admit it now, by a certain stiffness in the attitudes of the people, by the childish elaboration of their dress, so different 76 from the noble draperies which Sir Joshua's discourses on art had taught him to admire in the great painters, and by the innocent, inexpressive look in their young faces, for even the graybeards seemed young. And then suddenly, his gaze had lit on one of these faces in particular, that of a girl with round cheeks, high cheekbones, and widely set eyes under an intricate headdress of pearl-woven braids. Why, it was Tricia Kent to the life. And so far from being thought plain, the young lady was no other than the peerless princess about whom the tale revolved. And what a fairyland she lived in, full of lithe youths and round-faced pouting maidens, rosy old men and burnished blackamoors, pretty birds and cats and nibbling rabbits, and all involved and enclosed in golden balustrades, in colonnades 77 of pink and blue, laurel garlands festooned from ivory balconies, and domes and minarets against summer seas. Lewis's imagination lost itself in the scene. He forgot to regret the noble draperies, the exalted sentiments, the fuliginous backgrounds of the artists he had come to Italy to admire, forgot Sassoferrato, Guido Reni, Carlo Dolce, Lo Spagnolto, the Carracci, and even the Transfiguration of Raphael, though he knew it to be the greatest picture in the world. After that he had seen almost everything else that Italian art had to offer, had been to Florence, Naples, Rome, to Bologna to study the eclectic school, to Parma to examine the Correggios and the Giulio Romanos. But that first vision had laid a magic seed between his lips, the seed that makes you hear what the birds say and the grasses whisper. Even 78, if his English friend had not continued at his side, pointing out, explaining, inspiring, Lewis Racy flattered himself that the round face of the little Saint Ursula would have led him safely and confidently past all her rivals. She had become his touchstone, his star. How insipid seemed to him all the sheep-faced virgins draped in red and blue paint after he had looked into her wondering girlish eyes and traced the elaborate pattern of her brocades. He could remember now, quite distinctly, the day when he had given up even Beatrice Cenci. And as for that fat naked Magdalene of Carlo Dolce's, lolling over the book she was not reading and ogling the spectator in the good old way, Saint Ursula did not need to rescue him from her. His eyes had been opened to a new world of art, and this world it was his 79 mission to reveal to others. He, the insignificant and ignorant Lewis Racy, as but for the grace of God, and that chance encounter on Mont Blanc, he might have gone on being to the end. He shuddered to think of the army of Neapolitan beggar boys, bituminous monks, whirling prophets, languishing Madonnas, and pink-crumped Amorini who might have been traveling home with him in the hold of the fast new steam packet. His excitement had something of the apostle's ecstasy. He was not only, in a few hours, to embrace Trisci and be reunited to his honored parents, he was also to go forth and preach the new gospel to them that sat in the darkness of Salvator Rosa and Lo Spagnolto. The first thing that struck Louis was the smallness of the house on the Sound, and the largeness of Mr. Racy. He had expected to receive the opposite impression. In his recollection, the varnished Tuscan villa had retained something of its impressiveness, even when compared to its supposed originals. Perhaps the very contrast between their draughty distances and naked floors, and the expensive carpets and bright fires of High Point, magnified his memory of the latter. There were moments when the thought of its groaning boards certainly added to the effect. But the image of Mr. Racy had meanwhile dwindled. Everything about him, as his son looked back, seemed narrow, juvenile, almost childish. His bluster about Edgar Poe, for instance, true poet still to Louis, though he had since heard richer notes. His fussy tyranny of his womenkind, his un-81 conscious but total ignorance of most of the things, books, people, ideas that now filled his son's mind. Above all, the arrogance and incompetence of his artistic judgments. Beyond a narrow range of reading, mostly, Louis suspected, culled in drowsy after-dinner snatches from night's half-hours with the best authors, Mr. Racy made no pretense to book learning, left that, as he handsomely said, to the professors. But on matters of art he was dogmatic and explicit, prepared to justify his opinions by the citing of eminent authorities and of market prices, and quite clear, as his farewell talk with his son had shown, as to which old masters should be privileged to figure in the Racy collection. The young man felt no impatience of these judgments. America was a long way from Europe, and it was many years 82 since Mr. Racy had traveled. He could hardly be blamed for not knowing that the things he admired were no longer admirable, still less for not knowing why. The pictures before which Louis had knelt in spirit had been virtually undiscovered, even by art students and critics, in his father's youth. How was an American gentleman, filled with his own self-importance, and paying his courier the highest salary to show him the accredited masterpieces? How was he to guess that whenever he stood rapt before a Sassoferrato or a Carlo Dolce, one of those unknown treasures lurked near by under dust and cobwebs? No, Louis felt only tolerance and understanding. Such a view was not one to magnify the paternal image. But when the young man entered the study, where Mr. Racy sat immobilized by gout, the 83 swathed legs stretched along his sofa seemed only another reason for indulgence. Perhaps, Louis thought afterward, it was his father's prone position, the way his great bulk billowed over the sofa, and the lame leg reached out like a mountain ridge, that made him suddenly seem to fill the room, or else the sound of his voice booming irritably across the threshold and scattering Mrs. Racy and the girls with a fierce, "And now, ladies, if the hugging and kissing are over, I should be glad of a moment with my son." But it was odd that, after mother and daughters had withdrawn with all their hoops and flounces, the study seemed to grow even smaller, and Louis himself to feel more like a David without the pebble. "Well, my boy," his father cried, crimson and puffing, "here you are at home 84 again, with many adventures to relate, no doubt, and a few masterpieces to show me, as I gather from the drafts on my exchequer." "Oh, as to the masterpieces, sir, certainly," Louis simpered, wondering why his voice sounded so fluty, and his smile was produced with such a conscious muscular effort. "Good, good," Mr. Racy approved, waving a violet hand which seemed to be ripening for a bandage. "Reedy carried out my orders, I presume, saw to it that the paintings were deposited with the bulk of your luggage in Canal Street." "Oh yes, sir, Mr. Reedy was on the dock with precise instructions. You know he always carries out your orders," Louis ventured with a faint irony. Mr. Racy stared. "Mr. Reedy," he said, "does what I tell him, if that's what 85 you mean, otherwise he would hardly have been in my employ for over 30 years. Louis was silent, and his father examined him critically. "You appear to have filled out, your health is satisfactory. Well, well, Mr. Robert Huzzard and his daughters are dining here this evening, by the way, and will no doubt be expecting to see the latest French novelties in stocks and waistcoats. Malvina has become a very elegant figure, your sisters tell me. Mr. Racy chuckled, and Louis thought, I knew it was the oldest Huzzard girl, while a slight chill ran down his spine. As to the pictures, Mr. Racy pursued with growing animation, I am laid low, as you see, by this cursed affliction. Until the doctors get me up again, here must I lie and try to imagine how your treasures will look in the new gallery. 86. And meanwhile, my dear boy, I need hardly say that no one is to be admitted to see them till they have been inspected by me and suitably hung. Reedy shall begin unpacking at once, and when we move to town next month, Mrs. Racy, God willing, shall give the handsomest evening party New York has yet seen, to show my son's collection and perhaps, well, to celebrate another interesting event in his history. Louis met this with a faint but respectful gurgle, and before his blurred eyes rose the wistful face of Trishy Kent. Ah well, I shall see her tomorrow, he thought, taking heart again as soon as he was out of his father's presence. 87. Roman 6. Mr. Racy stood silent for a long time after making the round of the room in the Canal Street house, where the unpacked pictures had been set out. He had driven to town alone with Louis, sternly rebuffing his daughter's timid hints and Mrs. Racy's mute but visible yearning to accompany him. Though the gout was over, he was still weak and irritable, and Mrs. Racy, fluttered at the thought of crossing him, had swept the girls away at his first frown. Louis's hopes rose as he followed his parents' limping progress. The pictures, though standing on chairs and tables, and set clumsily askew to catch the light, 88, bloomed out of the half-dusk of the empty house with a new and persuasive beauty. Ah, how right he had been, how inevitable that his father should own it. Mr. Racy halted in the middle of the room. He was still silent, and his face, so quick to frown and glare, wore the calm, almost expressionless look known to Louis as the mask of inward perplexity. Oh, of course it will take a little time, the son thought, tingling with the eagerness of youth. At last, Mr. Racy woke the echoes by clearing his throat, but the voice which issued from it was as inexpressive as his face. It is singular, he said, how little the best copies of the old masters resemble the originals, for these are originals, he questioned, suddenly swinging about on Louis. Oh, absolutely, sir. Besides, the 89 young man was about to add, no one would ever have taken the trouble to copy them, but hastily checked himself. Besides, I meant, I had the most competent advice obtainable. So I assume, since it was the express condition on which I authorized your purchases. Louis felt himself shrinking and his father expanding, but he sent a glance along the wall, and beauty shed her reviving beam on him. Mr. Racy's brows projected ominously, but his face remained smooth and dubious. Once more he cast a slow glance about him. Let us, he said pleasantly, begin with the Raphael, and it was evident that he did not know which way to turn. Oh, sir, a Raphael nowadays, I 90 warned you it would be far beyond my budget. Mr. Racy's face fell slightly. I had hoped nevertheless, for an inferior specimen. Then, with an effort, the Sassoferrato then. Louis felt more at his ease, he even ventured a respectful smile. Sassoferrato is all inferior, isn't he? The fact is, he no longer stands, quite as he used to. Mr. Racy stood motionless. His eyes were vacuously fixed on the nearest picture. Sassoferrato, no longer. Well, sir, no, not for a collection of this quality. Louis saw that he had at last struck the right note. Something large and uncomfortable appeared to struggle in Mr. Racy's throat. Then he gave a cough. 91, which might almost have been said to cast out Sassoferrato. There was another pause before he pointed with his stick to a small picture representing a snub-nosed young woman with a high forehead and jeweled coif, against a background of delicately interwoven columbines. Is that, he questioned, your Carlo Dolce? The style is much the same, I see, but it seems to me lacking in his peculiar sentiment. Oh, but it's not a Carlo Dolce, it's a Piero della Francesca, sir, burst in triumph from the trembling Louis. His father sternly faced him. It's a copy, you mean? I thought so. No, not a copy, it's by a great painter, a much greater. Mr. Racy had reddened sharply at his mistake. To conceal his natural annoyance, he assumed a still more silken 92 manner. In that case, he said, I think I should like to see the inferior painters first. Where is the Carlo Dolce? There is no Carlo Dolce, said Louis, white to the lips. The young man's next distinct recollection was of standing, he knew not how long afterward, before the armchair in which his father had sunk down, almost as white and shaken as himself. This, stammered Mr. Racy, this is going to bring back my gout. But when Louis entreated, "Oh, sir, do let us drive back quietly to the country and give me a chance later to explain, to put my case," the old gentleman had struck through the pleading with a furious wave of his stick. "Explain later, put your case later. It's just what I insist upon your doing 93 here and now." And Mr. Racy added hoarsely, and as if in actual physical anguish, "I understand that young John Huzzard returned from Rome last week with a Raphael." After that, Louis heard himself, as if with the icy detachment of a spectator, marshalling his arguments, pleading the cause he hoped his pictures would have pleaded for him, dethroning the old powers and principalities, and setting up these new names in their place. It was first of all the names that stuck in Mr. Racy's throat. After spending a lifetime in committing to memory the correct pronunciation of words like Lo Spagnolto and Giulio Romano, it was bad enough, his wrathful eyes seemed to say, to have to begin a new set of verbal gymnastics before you could be sure of saying to a 94 friend with careless accuracy, "And this is my Giotto d'Abandon." But that was only the first shock, soon forgotten in the rush of greater tribulation. For one might conceivably learn how to pronounce Giotto d'Abandon, and even enjoy doing so, provided the friend in question recognized the name and bowed to its authority. But to have your effort received by a blank stare and the playful request, "You'll have to say that over again, please," to know that, in going the round of the gallery, the Racy Gallery, the same stare and the same request were likely to be repeated before each picture, the bitterness of this was so great that Mr. Racy, without exaggeration, might have likened his case to that of Agag. God, Carpenter, you say this other fellow's called. Kept him 95 back till the last because it's the gem of the collection, did you? Carpenter, well, he'd have done better to stick to his trade. Something to do with those new European steam cars, I suppose, eh?" Mr. Racy was so incensed that his irony was less subtle than usual. "And Angelico, you say, did that kind of Noah's Ark soldier in pink armor on gold leaf. Well, there I've caught you tripping, my boy. Not Angelico, Angelica. Angelica Kaufman was a lady. And the damned swindler who foisted that barbarous daub on you as a picture of hers deserves to be drawn and quartered, and shall be, sir, by God, if the law can reach him. He shall disgorge every penny he's rooked you out of, or my name's not Halston Racy. A bargain. You say the thing was a bargain. Why, the price of a clean postage stamp would be too dear 96 for it. God, my son, do you realize you had a trust to carry out?" "Yes, sir, yes, and it's just because. You might have written, you might at least have placed your views before me." How could Louis say, "If I had, I knew you'd have refused to let me buy the pictures"? He could only stammer, "I did allude to the revolution in taste, new names coming up, you may remember." Revolution, new names, who says so? I had a letter last week from the London dealers to whom I especially recommended you, telling me that an undoubted Guido Reni was coming into the market this summer. Oh, the dealers, they don't know. The dealers don't, who does, except yourself? Mr. Racy pronounced in a white sneer 97. Louis, as white, still held his ground. "I wrote you, sir, about my friends, in Italy and afterward in England." "Well, God damn it, I never heard of one of their names before, either, no more'n of these painters of yours here. I supplied you with the names of all the advisors you needed, and all the painters, too. I all but made the collection for you myself before you started. I was explicit enough, in all conscience was I." Louis smiled faintly. "That's what I hoped the pictures would be." "What's be what you mean?" "Be explicit, speak for themselves. Make you see that their painters are already superseding some of the better known." Mr. Racy gave an awful laugh. "They are they? In whose estima 98 Tion, your friends, I suppose. What's the name again of that fellow you met in Italy who picked 'em out for you?" "Ruskin, John Ruskin," said Louis. Mr. Racy's laugh, prolonged, gathered up into itself a fresh shower of expletives. Ruskin, just plain John Ruskin, eh? And who is this great John Ruskin, who sets God Almighty right in his judgments? Who'd you say John Ruskin's father was now?" "A respected wine merchant in London, sir." Mr. Racy ceased to laugh. He looked at his son with an expression of unutterable disgust. "Retail. I believe so. Fa, said Mr. Racy. It wasn't only Ruskin, father. I told you of those other friends in Lawn 99 Dawn, whom I met on the way home. They inspected the pictures, and all of them agreed that the collection would someday be very valuable. Someday, did they give you a date? The month and the year? Ah, those other friends, yes. You said there was a Mr. Brown and a Mr. Hunt and a Mr. Rossiter, was it? Well, I never heard of any of those names, either, except perhaps in a trades directory. It's not Rossiter, father, Dante Rossetti. Excuse me, Rossetti. And what does Mr. Dante Rossetti's father do? Sell macaroni, I presume. Lewis was silent, and Mr. Racy went on, speaking now with a deadly steadiness. The friends I sent you to were judges of art, sir, men who know what a picture's worth. Not one of 'em but 100 could pick out a genuine Raphael. Couldn't you find 'em when you got to England? Or hadn't they the time to spare for you? You'd better not, Mr. Racy added. Tell me that, for I know how they'd have received your father's son. Oh, most kindly, they did indeed, sir. Aye, but that didn't suit you. You didn't want to be advised. You wanted to show off before a lot of ignoramuses like yourself. You wanted, how'd I know what you wanted? It's as if I'd never given you an instruction or laid a charge on you. And the money, God, where'd it go to buying this nonsense? Mr. Racy raised himself heavily on his stick and fixed his angry eyes on his son. Own up, Lewis, tell me they got it out of you at cards. Professional gamblers 101 the lot, I make no doubt. Your Ruskin and your Morris and your Rossiter. Make a business to pick up young American greenhorns on their travels, I dare say. No, not that you say, then women. God Almighty, Lewis, gasped Mr. Racy, tottering toward his son with outstretched stick. I'm no blue-nosed Puritan, sir, and I'd a damn sight rather you told me you spent it on a woman, every penny of it, than let yourself be fleeced like a simpleton, buying these things that look more like cuts out O. Fox's Book of Martyrs than originals of the old masters for a gentleman's gallery. Youth's youth. Gad, sir, I've been young myself. A fellow's got to go through his apprenticeship. Own up now, women. Oh, not women. Not even, Mr. Racy groaned. All wanted to in pictures then. Well, say no more to me now. I'll get home, I'll get home. He cast a last apoplectic glance about the room. The Racy gallery, that pack of bones and mummers' finery. Why, let alone the rest, there's not a full-bodied female among 'em. Do you know what those Madonnas of yours are like, my son? Why, there ain't one of 'em that don't remind me of a bad likeness of poor Trishy Kent. I should say you hired half the sign painters of Europe to do her portrait for you, if I could imagine you're wanting it. No, sir, I don't need your arm, Mr. Racy snarled, heaving his great bulk painfully across the hall. He withered Lewis with a last look from the doorstep. And to buy that you overdrew your account. No, I'll drive home alone 103. Romans 7. Mr. Racy did not die till nearly a year later. But New York agreed it was the affair of the pictures that had killed him. The day after his first and only sight of them, he sent for his lawyer, and it became known that he had made a new will. Then he took to his bed with a return of the gout, and grew so rapidly worse that it was thought only proper to postpone the party. Mrs. Racy was to have given that autumn to inaugurate the gallery. This enabled the family to pass over in silence the question of the works of art themselves. But outside of the Racy house, where they were never men 140, they formed, that winter, a frequent and fruitful topic of discussion. Only two persons besides Mr. Racy were known to have seen them. One was Mr. Donaldson Kent, who owed the privilege to the fact of having once been to Italy, the other, Mr. Reedy, the agent, who had unpacked the pictures. Mr. Reedy, beset by Racy cousins and old family friends, had replied with genuine humility, Why, the truth is, I never was taught to see any difference between one picture and another, except as regards the size of them, and these struck me as smallish. On the small side, I would say. Mr. Kent was known to have unbosomed himself to Mr. Racy with considerable frankness. He went so far, it was rumored, as to declare that he had never seen any pictures in Italy like those 105 brought back by Lewis, and begged to doubt if they really came from there. But in public, he maintained that non-committal attitude which passed for prudence, but proceeded only from timidity. No one ever got anything from him but the guarded statement. The subjects are wholly inoffensive. It was believed that Mr. Racy dared not consult the Huzzards. Young John Huzzard had just brought home a Raphael. It would have been hard not to avoid comparisons which would have been too galling. Neither to them, nor to anyone else, did Mr. Racy ever again allude to the Racy gallery. But when his will was opened, it was found that he had bequeathed the pictures to his son. The rest of his property was left absolutely to his two daughters. The bulk of the estate was Mrs. Racy's, but it was known that 106 Mrs. Racy had had her instructions, and among them, perhaps, was the order to fade away in her turn after 6 months of widowhood. When she had been laid beside her husband in Trinity Churchyard, her will, made in the same week as Mr. Racy's, and obviously at his dictation, was found to allow $5,000 a year to Lewis during his lifetime. The residue of the fortune, which Mr. Racy's thrift and good management had made into one of the largest in New York, was divided between the daughters. Of these, the one promptly married a Kent and the other a Hazard, and the latter, Sarah Ann, who had never been Lewis's favorite, was wont to say in later years, "Oh no, I never grudged my poor brother those funny old pictures. You see, we have a Raphael 107. The house stood on the corner of 3rd Avenue and 10th Street. It had lately come to Lewis Racy as his share in the property of a distant cousin, who had made an old New York will, under which all his kin benefited in proportion to their consanguinity. The neighborhood was unfashionable, and the house in bad repair, but Mr. and Mrs. Lewis Racy, who, since their marriage, had been living in retirement at Tarrytown, immediately moved into it. Their arrival excited small attention. Within a year of his father's death, Lewis had married Tricia Kent. The alliance had not been encouraged by Mr. and Mrs. Kent, who went so far as to say that their niece might have done better. But as that one of their sons who was still unmarried had always shown a lively sympathy for Tricia, they yielded to the prudent one. Thought that, after all, it was better than having her entangle Bill. The Lewis Racys had been 4 years married, and during that time had dropped out of the memory of New York as completely as if their exile had covered half a century. Neither of them had ever cut a great figure there. Tricia had been nothing but the Kents, Cinderella, and Lewis's ephemeral importance, as heir to the Racy millions, had been effaced by the painful episode which resulted in his being deprived of them. So secluded was their way of living, and so much had it come to be a habit, that when Lewis announced that he had inherited Uncle Ebenezer's house, his wife hardly looked up from the baby blanket she was embroidering. Uncle Ebenezer's house in New York, 109. He drew a deep breath. Now I shall be able to show the pictures. Oh, Lewis, she dropped the blanket. Are we going to live there? Certainly, but the house is so large that I shall turn the 2 corner rooms on the ground floor into a gallery. They are very suitably lighted. It was there that Cousin Ebenezer was laid out. Oh, Lewis! If anything could have made Lewis Racy believe in his own strength of will, it was his wife's attitude. Merely to hear that unquestioning murmur of submission was to feel something of his father's tyrannous strength arise in him, but with the wish to use it more humanely. You'll like that, Tricia. It's been dull for you here, I know. She flushed up. Dull, with you 110, darling. Besides, I like the country, but I shall like 10th Street too. Only you said there were repairs. He nodded sternly. I shall borrow money to make them. If necessary, he lowered his voice, I shall mortgage the pictures. He saw her eyes fill. Oh, but it won't be. There are so many ways still in which I can economize. He laid his hand on hers and turned his profile toward her, because he knew it was so much stronger than his full face. He did not feel sure that she quite grasped his intention about the pictures, was not even certain that he wished her to. He went into New York every week now, occupying himself mysteriously and importantly with plans, specifications, and other business transactions with long names, while Tricia, through the hot 111 summer months, sat in Tarrytown and waited for the baby. A little girl was born at the end of the summer and christened Louisa, and when she was a few weeks old, the Lewis Racys left the country for New York. Now, thought Lewis, as they bumped over the cobblestones of 10th Street in the direction of Cousin Ebenezer's house. The carriage stopped, he handed out his wife, the nurse followed with the baby, and they all stood and looked up at the house front. Oh, Lewis, Tricia gasped, and even little Louisa set up a sympathetic wail. Over the door, over Cousin Ebenezer's respectable, conservative, and intensely private front door, hung a large sign 112 board bearing, in gold letters on a black ground, the inscription, Gallery of Christian Art. Open on weekdays from 2 to 4. Admission 25 cents, children 10 cents. Lewis saw his wife turn pale and pressed her arm in his. Believe me, it's the only way to make the pictures known, And they must be made known, he said with a thrill of his old ardor. Yes, dear, of course, but to everyone publicly. If we showed them only to our friends, of what use would it be? Their opinion is already formed. She sighed her acknowledgement, but the entrance fee. If we can afford it later, the gallery will be free. But meanwhile 113. Oh, Louis, I quite understand. And clinging to him, the still protesting baby in her wake, she passed with a dauntless step under the awful signboard. At last I shall see the pictures properly lighted, she exclaimed, and turned in the hall to fling her arms about her husband. It's all they need, to be appreciated, he answered, aglow with her encouragement. Since his withdrawal from the world, it had been a part of Louis's system never to read the daily papers. His wife eagerly conformed to his example, and they lived in a little airtight circle of aloofness, as if the cottage at Tarrytown had been situated in another and happier planet. Louis, nevertheless, the day after the opening of the Gallery of Christian Art, 114, deemed it his duty to derogate from this attitude, and sallied forth secretly to buy the principal journals. When he re-entered his house, he went straight up to the nursery where he knew that, at that hour, Trichy would be giving the little girl her bath. But it was later than he supposed. The rite was over, the baby lay asleep in its modest cot, and the mother sat crouched by the fire, her face hidden in her hands. Louis instantly guessed that she too had seen the papers. Trichy, you mustn't consider this of any consequence, he stammered. She lifted a tear-stained face. Oh, my darling, I thought you never read the papers. Not usually, but I thought it my duty 115. Yes, I see, but as you say, what earthly consequence? None whatever, we must just be patient and persist. She hesitated, and then, her arms about him, her head on his breast. Only, dearest, I've been counting up again, ever so carefully, and even if we give up fires everywhere but in the nursery, I'm afraid the wages of the doorkeeper and the guardian, especially if the galleries open to the public every day. I've thought of that already too, and I myself shall hereafter act as doorkeeper and guardian. He kept his eyes on hers as he spoke. This is the test, he thought. Her face paled under its brown glow and the eyes dilated in her effort to check her tears. Then she said gaily, that will be very interesting, won't it, Louis? Hear 116ing what the people say, because as they begin to know the pictures better and to understand them, they can't fail to say very interesting things. Can they? She turned and caught up the sleeping Louisa. Can they? Oh, you darling, darling. Louis turned away too. Not another woman in New York would have been capable of that. He could hear all the town echoing with this new scandal of his showing the pictures himself. And she, so much more sensitive to ridicule, so much less carried away by apostolic ardor, how much louder must that mocking echo ring in her ears? But his pang was only momentary. The one thought that possessed him for any length of time was that of vindicating himself by making the pictures known. He could no longer fix his attention on lesser matters. The derision 117 of illiterate journalists was not a thing to wince at. Once let the pictures be seen by educated and intelligent people, and they would speak for themselves, especially if he were at hand to interpret them. 118. Roman 8. For a week or two, a great many people came to the gallery, but even with Louis as interpreter, the pictures failed to make themselves heard. During the first days, indeed, owing to the unprecedented idea of holding a paying exhibition in a private house, and to the mockery of the newspapers, the Gallery of Christian Art was thronged with noisy curiosity-seekers. Once the astonished Metropolitan Police had to be invited in to calm their comments and control their movements. But the name of Christian Art soon chilled this class of sightseer, and before long they were replaced by a dumb and respectable throng, who 119 roamed vacantly through the rooms and out again, grumbling that it wasn't worth the money. Then these two diminished, and once the tide had turned, the ebb was rapid. Every day from 2 to 4 Louis still sat shivering among his treasures, or patiently measured the length of the deserted gallery. As long as there was a chance of anyone coming, he would not admit that he was beaten, for the next visitor might always be the one who understood. One snowy February day, he had thus paced the rooms in unbroken solitude for above an hour when carriage wheels stopped at the door. He hastened to open it, and in a great noise of silks, his sister Sarah Ann Huzzard entered. Louis felt for a moment, as he used to under his father's glance. Marriage and millions had given the moon-faced Sarah 120-something of the racy awfulness, but her brother looked into her empty eyes, and his own kept their level. "Well, Louis," said Mrs. Huzzard with a simpering sternness, and caught her breath. "Well, Sarah Ann, I'm happy that you've come to take a look at my pictures. I've come to see you and your wife." She gave another nervous gasp, shook out her flounces, and added in a rush, "and to ask you how much longer this spectacle is to continue." "The exhibition," Louis smiled. She signed a flushed assent. "Well, there has been a considerable falling off lately in the number of visitors." "Thank heaven," she interjected. "But as long as I feel that anyone wishes to come, I shall be here, to open the door as you see." She sent a shuddering glance about her. "Louis, I wonder if you realize." "Oh, fully." "Then why do you go on? Isn't it enough? Aren't you satisfied with the effect they have produced?" "With the effect you have produced, on your family and on the whole of New York, with the slur on poor Papa's memory." "Papa left me the pictures, Sarah Ann." "Yes, but not to make yourself a mountebank about them." Louis considered this impartially. "Are you sure? Perhaps, on the contrary, he did it for that very reason." "Oh, don't heap more insults on our father's memory. Things are bad enough 122 without that. How your wife can allow it I can't see. Do you ever consider the humiliation to her?" Louis gave another dry smile. "She's used to being humiliated. The Kents accustomed her to that." Sarah Ann reddened. "I don't know why I should stay to be spoken to in this way, but I came with my husband's approval." "Do you need that to come and see your brother?" "I need it to make the offer I am about to make, and which he authorizes." Louis looked at her in surprise, and she purpled up to the lace ruffles inside her satin bonnet. "Have you come to make an offer for my collection?" he asked her, humorously. "You seem to take pleasure in insinuating preposterous things, but anything 123 is better than this public slight on our name." Again she ran a shuddering glance over the pictures. "John and I," she announced, "are prepared to double the allowance Mother left you on condition that this ends, for good, that horrible sign is taken down tonight." Louis seemed mildly to weigh the proposal. "Thank you very much, Sarah Ann," he said at length. "I'm touched and surprised that you and John should have made this offer, but perhaps before I decline it you will accept mine, simply to show you my pictures. When once you've looked at them I think you'll understand." Mrs. Huzzard drew back hastily, her air of majesty collapsing. "Look at 124 the pictures." "Oh, thank you, but I can see them very well from here. And besides, I don't pretend to be a judge." "Then come up and see Tricia and the baby," said Louis quietly. She stared at him, embarrassed. "Oh, thank you," she stammered again, and as she prepared to follow him, "Then it's no, really no, Louis. Do consider, my dear, you say yourself that hardly anyone comes. What harm can there be in closing the place? What, when tomorrow the man may come who understands?" Mrs. Huzzard tossed her plumes despairingly, and followed him in silence. "What, Mary Adeline?" she exclaimed, pausing abruptly on the threshold of the nursery. Tricia, as usual, sat holding her baby by the fire, and from a low seat opposite her rose a lady as richly furred and feathered as Mrs. Huzzard, but with 125 far less assurance to carry off her furbelows. Mrs. Kent ran to Louis and laid her plump cheek against his, while Tricia greeted Sarah Ann. "I had no idea you were here, Mary Adeline," Mrs. Huzzard murmured. It was clear that she had not imparted her philanthropic project to her sister, and was disturbed at the idea that Louis might be about to do so. "I just dropped in for a minute," she continued, "to see that darling little pet of an angel child," and she enveloped the astonished baby in her ample rustlings and flutterings. "I'm very glad to see you here, Sarah Ann," Mary Adeline answered with simplicity. "Ah, it's not for want of wishing that I haven't come before. Tricia knows that, I hope, but the cares of a household like mine, 126. "Yes, and it's been so difficult to get about in the bad weather," Tricia suggested sympathetically. Mrs. Huzzard lifted the racy eyebrows. "Has it really? With 2 pairs of horses one hardly notices the weather. Oh, the pretty, pretty, pretty baby, Mary Adeline," Sarah Ann continued, turning severely to her sister. "I shall be happy to offer you a seat in my carriage if you're thinking of leaving." But Mary Adeline was a married woman too. She raised her mild head and her glance crossed her sister's quietly. "My own carriage is at the door, Thank you kindly, Sarah Ann, she said, and the baffled Sarah Ann withdrew on Lewis's arm. But a moment later the old habit of subordination reasserted itself. Mary Adeline's gentle countenance grew as 127 timorous as a child S, and she gathered up her cloak in haste. Perhaps I was too quick. I'm sure she meant it kindly, she exclaimed, overtaking Lewis as he turned to come up the stairs, and with a smile he stood watching his two sisters drive off together in the Huzzard coach. He returned to the nursery, where Tricia was still crooning over her daughter. Well, my dear, he said, what do you suppose Sarah Ann came for? And, in reply to her wondering gaze, to buy me off from showing the pictures. His wife's indignation took just the form he could have wished. She simply went on with her rich cooing laugh and hugged the baby tighter. But Lewis felt the perverse desire to lay a still greater strain upon her loyalty. 128. Offered to double my allowance, she and John, if only I'll take down the sign. No one shall touch the sign, Tricia flamed. Not till I do, said her husband grimly. She turned about and scanned him with anxious eyes. Lewis, you. Oh, my dear, they're right. It can't go on forever. He went up to her and put his arm about her and the child. You've been braver than an army of heroes, but it won't do. The expenses have been a good deal heavier than I was led to expect. And I can't raise a mortgage on the pictures. Nobody will touch them. She met this quickly. No, I know. That was what Mary Adeline came about. 129. The blood rushed angrily to Lewis's temples. Mary Adeline, how the devil did she hear of it? Through Mr. Reedy, I suppose. But you must not be angry. She was kindness itself. She doesn't want you to close the gallery, Lewis. That is, not as long as you really continue to believe in it. She and Donald Kent will lend us enough to go on with for a year longer. That is what she came to say. For the first time since the struggle had begun, Lewis Racy's throat was choked with tears. His faithful Mary Adeline. He had a sudden vision of her, stealing out of the house at high point before daylight to carry a basket of scraps to the poor Mrs. Edgar Poe, who was dying of a decline down the lane. He laughed aloud in his joy. Dear old Mary Adeline, how mag 130 of her, enough to give me a whole year more. He pressed his wet cheek against his wife's in a long silence. Well, dear, he said at length, it's for you to say, do we accept? He held her off, questioningly, at arm's length, and her wan little smile met his own and mingled with it. Of course we accept. 131. Roman 9. Of the Racy family, which prevailed so powerfully in the New York of the 40s, only one of the names survived in my boyhood, half a century later. Like so many of the descendants of the proud little colonial society, the Racys had totally vanished, forgotten by everyone but a few old ladies, one or two genealogists and the sexton of Trinity Church, who kept the record of their graves. The Racy blood was of course still to be traced in various allied families, Kents, Huzzards, Cosbys, and many others, proud to claim cousinship with a signer, but already indifferent or incurious as to the fate of his progeny. These old new 132 Yorkers, who lived so well and spent their money so liberally, vanished like a pinch of dust when they disappeared from their pews and their dinner tables. If I happen to have been familiar with the name since my youth, it is chiefly because its one survivor was a distant cousin of my mother, S., whom she sometimes took me to see on days when she thought I was likely to be good because I had been promised a treat for the morrow. Old Miss Alethea Racy lived in a house I had always heard spoken of as Cousin Ebenezer S. It had evidently, in its day, been an admired specimen of domestic architecture, but was now regarded as the hideous though venerable relic of a bygone age. Miss Racy, being crippled by rheumatism, sat above stairs in a large cold room, meagerly furnished with beadwork tables, rosewood étagères 133, and portraits of pale, sad-looking people in odd clothes. She herself was large and saturnine, with a battlemented black lace cap, and so deaf that she seemed a survival of forgotten days, a Rosetta Stone to which the clue was lost. Even to my mother, nursed in that vanished tradition, and knowing instinctively to whom Miss Racy alluded when she spoke of Mary Adeline, Sarah Ann, or Uncle Doctor, intercourse with her was difficult and languishing, and my juvenile interruptions were oftener encouraged than reproved. In the course of one of these visits my eye, listlessly roaming, singled out among the pallid portraits a three-crayon drawing of a little girl with a large forehead and dark eyes, dressed in a plaid frock and embroidered panelettes, and sitting on a grass bank. I pulled my mother's sleeve 134 to ask who she was, and my mother answered, "Ah, that was poor little Louisa Racy, who died of a decline. How old was little Louisa when she died, Cousin Alethea?" To batter this simple question into Cousin Alethea's brain was the affair of 10 laborious minutes, and when the job was done, and Miss Racy, with an air of mysterious displeasure, had dropped a deep 11, my mother was too exhausted to continue, so she turned to me to add, with one of the private smiles we kept for each other, "It was the poor child who would have inherited the Racy gallery." But to a little boy of my age, this item of information lacked interest, nor did I understand my mother's surreptitious amusement. This far-off scene suddenly came back to me last year, when, on one of my in 135 frequent visits to New York, I went to dine with my old friend, the banker, John Selwyn, and came to an astonished stand before the mantelpiece in his new library. "Hallo," I said, looking up at the picture above the chimney. My host squared his shoulders, thrust his hands into his pockets, and affected the air of modesty which people think it proper to assume when their possessions are admired. "The Macrino d'Alba? Why, yes. It was the only thing I managed to capture out of the Racy collection." "The only thing, well." "Ah, but you should have seen the Mantegna, and the Giotto, and the Piero della Francesca. Hang it, one of the most beautiful Piero della Francescas in the world. A girl in profile with her hair in a pearl net against a background of columbines. That went back to Europe 136, the National Gallery, I believe. And the Carpaccio, the most exquisite little St. George. That went to California. Lord." He sat down with the sigh of a hungry man turned away from a groaning board. "Well, it nearly broke me buying this," he murmured, as if at least that fact were some consolation. I was turning over my early memories, in quest of a clue to what he spoke of as the Racy collection, in a tone which implied that he was alluding to objects familiar to all art lovers. Suddenly, they weren't poor little Louis's pictures by any chance? I asked, remembering my mother's cryptic smile. Selwyn looked at me perplexedly. "Who the deuce is poor little Louisa?" And without waiting for my answer, he went on, "They were that fool Netta 137 Cosbys until a year ago, and she never even knew it." We looked at each other interrogatively, my friend perplexed at my ignorance, and I now absorbed in trying to run down the genealogy of Netta Cosby. I did so finally. "Netta Cosby, you do mean Netta Kent, the one who married Jim Cosby." "That's it, they were cousins of the Racys, and she inherited the pictures." I continued to ponder. "I wanted awfully to marry her the year I left Harvard," I said presently, more to myself than to my hearer. "Well, if you had, you'd have annexed a prize fool, and one of the most beautiful collections of Italian primitives in the world." "In the world?" "Well, you wait till you see them if you haven't already, and I seem to make 138 out that you haven't, that you can't have. How long have you been in Japan? 4 years, I thought so. Well, it was only last winter that Netta found out." "Found out what?" "What there was an old Alethea Racy's attic. You must remember the old Miss Racy who lived in that hideous house in 10th Street when we were children. She was a cousin of your mother's, wasn't she? Well, the old fool lived there for nearly half a century, with 5 millions worth of pictures shut up in the attic over her head. It seems they'd been there ever since the death of a poor young Racy who collected them in Italy years and years ago. I don't know much about the story. I never was strong on genealogy, and the Racys have always been rather dim to me. They were everybody's cousins, of course, but as far as one can 139 make out, that seems to have been their principal if not their only function. Oh, and I suppose the Racy building was called after them, only they didn't build it. But there was this one young fellow, I wish I could find out more about him. All that Netta seems to know or to care, for that matter, is that when he was very young, barely out of college, he was sent to Italy by his father to buy old masters in the 40s, it must have been, and came back with this extraordinary, this unbelievable collection. A boy of that age. And was disinherited by the old gentleman for bringing home such rubbish. The young fellow and his wife died ever so many years ago, both of them. It seems he was so laughed at for buying such pictures that they went away and lived like hermits in the depths of the country. There were some funny spectral 140 portraits of them that old Alethea had up in her bedroom. Netta showed me one of them the last time I went to see her. A pathetic drawing of the only child, an anemic little girl with a big forehead. Jove, but that must have been your little Louisa. I nodded, in a plaid frock and embroidered pantalettes. Yes, something of the sort. Well, when Louisa and her parents died, I suppose the pictures went to old Miss Racy. At any rate, at some time or other, and it must have been longer ago than you or I can remember, the old lady inherited them with the 10th Street house. And when she died, 3 or 4 years ago, her relations found she'd never even been upstairs to look at them. Well, she died intestate, and Netta 141 Kent, Netta Cosby, turned out to be the next of kin. There wasn't much to be got out of the estate, or so they thought, and as the Cosbys are always hard up, the house in 10th Street had to be sold, and the pictures were very nearly sent off to the auction room with all the rest of the stuff. But nobody supposed they would bring anything, and the auctioneer said that if you tried to sell pictures with carpets and bedding and kitchen furniture, it always depreciated the whole thing. And so, as the Cosbys had some bare walls to cover, they sent for the lot. There were about 30, and decided to have them cleaned and hang them up. After all, Netta said, as well as I can make out through the cobwebs, some of them look like rather jolly copies of early Italian things. But as she was short of cash, she decided to clean them at home instead of 142 sending them to an expert. And one day, while she was operating on this very one before you, with her sleeves rolled up, the man called who always does call on such occasions. The man who knows. In the given case, it was a quiet fellow connected with the Louvre, who'd brought her a letter from Paris, and whom she'd invited to one of her stupid dinners. He was announced, and she thought it would be a joke to let him see what she was doing. She has pretty arms, you may remember. So he was asked into the dining room, where he found her with a pail of hot water and soap suds, and this laid out on the table, and the first thing he did was to grab her pretty arm so tight that it was black and blue, while he shouted out, "God in heaven, not hot water." My friend leaned back with a sigh of mingled resentment and satisfaction, and 143, we sat silently looking up at the lovely adoration above the mantelpiece. That's how I got it a little cheaper. Most of the old varnish was gone for good. But luckily for her, it was the first picture she had attacked, and as for the others, you must see them, that's all I can say. Wait, I've got the catalog somewhere about. He began to rummage for it, and I asked, remembering how nearly I had married Netta Kent, do you mean to say she didn't keep a single one of them? Oh yes, in the shape of pearls and Rolls-Royces, and you've seen their new house in Fifth Avenue. He ended with a grin of irony. The best of the joke is that Jim was just thinking of divorcing her when the pictures were discovered. Poor little Louisa, I sighed. The end.